On side affirmative, we believe in the notion that if you go to a school that is funded by the government, if you exist in a country where there is a system set up that provides you with that education, the goal of that education ought to be to provide some level of equality of access to education for all children within New Zealand, and particularly for those children who, by various other facets, are disadvantaged in their lives. So towards that end, what we support in affirmative is the setting up of a system whereby kids are allocated or have allocated either to a school or to like a couple of schools in which they can choose. They then have given basically free bus services to get to those schools and to get to those places. And the rough goal of this is to achieve some sort of parity between all public schools in New Zealand, around like a decile 5, 6, whatever. Basically, the goal is to implement a system where we take people out of schools under the status quo are de facto private. Those are schools like Liquid Grammar or Wellington College, places where there are very high house prices in the area, places where almost everyone that goes to those schools are themselves very wealthy, and take those kids to places that traditionally have much lower socioeconomic background kids there, and vice versa. 2 points in substantive. Firstly, I'm going to explain why it is likely that you're able to implement a system that is much better at educating kids, the majority of kids around New Zealand in this sort of circumstance. Then secondly, benefits that we get in terms of integration of different social strata. We also would note and set up that we're happy to support things like we would probably ban the creation of new private schools and those sorts of things. I'll discuss that later, but that's basically the model as it stands. Turning then to the first point of substantive, which is about how we implement a better system of education. And there's a couple of things to say here when setting up a problem. The first of those is that the quality of a school is something that parents select quite highly for when they're deciding where they want to live and deciding the places that they want to move to. The result of that is that schools that traditionally have had a lot of wealthy kids and as such have traditionally done very well, schools like Liquid Grammar, schools like Wellington College, subsequently have very high house prices because there's quite a lot of demand for houses in those areas. The result of that is that it pushes out poorer people from living in those areas and it forces a system where the people that are able to get to schools that already are doing well and already are prestigious are themselves wealthy. The result of that is manifold. The first thing to say is that schools that are prestigious because they do well often are attractive to teachers. That's for a couple of reasons. The first of those is just a sense of professional pride to work with kids that consistently get excellences in their NCA, and to avoid sorts of things like having kids in your classes that are, that have troubled backgrounds, that require a lot more work, that are often a lot more troublesome in the classroom because of those backgrounds. So the selective pressures there by which the best teachers, the people who can make the most difference in kids' lives, disproportionately go to the places where that impact is felt the least. The result of that is that schools that are wealthy, schools that have wealthy kids, get the wealthy teachers, they do better. But on top of that, there is already a structural advantage of this kind of system, and that schools that have wealthy parents within them have some advantages. That is to say that there is a significant incentive for you as a parent who loves your kids to try to do the best that you can for their education. And the result of that is that parents who have money often donate that money, often donate their time. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds do not have money to donate and are much less likely to have the time to give up because they need to do other things, more likely to need to work more hours of the day, those sorts of things. The result of that is that you have better teachers, you have better, more prestigious history in place that attracts people to your school, and you have better involvement from parents. In these circumstances, where you mix up the number of wealthy parents to lower socioeconomic parents within a school, you have a number of benefits. The first of those is you, in the immediate sense, remove a lot of the incentive by which teachers move from place to place and from school to school, because the primary thing driving them is the fact that they'll have professional pride. But if everywhere is on some sort of level background in terms of their socioeconomic background, the results you see across those schools are likely to level out quite significantly. But the second thing there is that you distribute those wealthy parents who have time to give up and have money to give up in ways that are beneficial. That looks like, for example, schools that like suffer earthquake damage or whatever else, being able to fund repairs to school halls and those sorts of things. It means that in schools that have a significant proportion of poorer kids, you're likely to be able to run things like school breakfasts and those sorts of things. Because the important thing is that the wealthy parents are invested not just specifically in the welfare of their child, but in the quality of their school. So that involves them donating, but you can redistribute that when you're at school whatever way you want. Therefore, we say, given that the goal of the system ought to be to lift kids up out of poverty, to provide them with educations by which they can get good jobs, to go to university, to upskill themselves, it is imperative that we're able to institute some level of equality within the educational system. The second thing to talk about then is about the social impacts. And the mechanism that underlies here is quite similar to that at the beginning. Basically, it says, if you go to school with people who are not like you, you come to understand a life that is not your own. And this is something that, sometimes in debating seems a bit silly, but it is genuinely quite an important effect that people who live only amongst people from their own social strata do not understand the troubles of other people and are unlikely to relate to them. In this circumstance, where you are friends with someone at school who is not like you, where you go to school with someone, or go and play with them at school, at their house after school, you're more likely to understand where they come from and relate to them. And that's the sort of thing that changes your behaviours when you grow up, but it's also the sort of thing that changes your parents' behaviours. Whether that be when you're making hiring decisions and voting preferences and those sorts of things at a high level, but it's also just the way that you interact with people in a day-to-day way, the way that you express your prejudices, the way that you express your biases. You're more likely to associate with other people, to understand them, and to do right by them in the long term, in the circumstances where you've grown up together.
Excellent. I'd like to welcome First Speaker.
Penno spent the majority of his speech arguing that we need greater socioeconomic integration in our public schools. We agree entirely, so all of that material was irrelevant. However, we think that integration is best achieved by addressing the underlying issues, which is to say residential segregation that drive the current segregation in our public schools. What am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, I'm going to explain what we support and why we think we can achieve it. Then I'm going to explain why it's a far better mechanism of tackling segregation in schools than theirs. Firstly, what we support. We want to use the political capital they have to have the government aggressively move towards housing integration. What I mean by that is that the government should aggressively adopt policies that aim to make residential areas more socioeconomically diverse. This looks like the removal of zoning regulations and redlining that prevent the construction of cheap houses in high-income neighborhoods, and it looks like active moves by the government to build cheap state housing in high-income neighborhoods. Insofar as this move to residential integration isn't totally successful, we also think that the government should move towards equalizing the funding that is available to schools in different neighborhoods. We actually think it should give a lot more money to schools in poor neighborhoods, and it should aggressively reallocate good teachers towards those schools. We think that's also a problem that I've talked about, even if our move towards residential integration isn't fully successful. Why are we likely to successfully move towards political integration? Firstly, just by fiat, we get to co-opt all of their political capital to implement the busing proposal to do this. I want to note, moreover, a couple of additional things. Firstly, much of the political backlash that applies to moves towards residential integration also applies to busing. For example, much of the backlash to residential integration is driven by the fact that the construction of state housing in high-income areas lowers housing prices. But that equally applies to busing, right? Because the prices of houses in the Wellington College Zone or the Auckland Grammar Zone are to a great degree artificially inflated by the fact that they're in that zone, which means lots of wealthy families want to move there so their kids can go to those schools. So their policy also causes housing prices to crash and therefore generates similar political backlash to the sorts of moves that we support. The second thing I want to note is that even insofar as we have less political capital and therefore generate somewhat less residential integration than what they can accomplish through busing, we use that political capital far more effectively because there are benefits to residential integration that extend far beyond the integration of schools, right? So when you integrate residential communities, poor kids don't only get access to wealthier schools, they also get access to wealthier communities, non-school amenities, generally more pleasant environments, and so on. So insofar as this is a debate about how to take the finite amount of political capital and whether to use it to implement busing or residential integration, even if the residential integration we achieve is somewhat less than the busing integration we achieve, it's far more valuable because there are non-schooling benefits to residential integration. The final thing I want to note is that there's already a reasonable amount of residential integration, which means that zones aren't as exclusionary as they wanted to say. That's because zones tend to be quite large and tend to include both wealthy and poor areas of different neighborhoods. For example, the zone for Wellington College includes both poor and wealthy areas of Mount Vic and Newtown. That means there's already a degree of residential integration. The examples they wanted to focus on were extreme, so zones weren't necessarily that problematic. For all of those reasons, we think we can get a substantial amount of housing integration with the political capital that they use to implement busing. Why do we think that's better? Basically, we think enforced busing is extremely harmful to the kids that are forced to bus. Why is that? Note that the bus trips that kids are forced to go on tend to be quite long because urban areas are large, because traffic is congested, and because zones are quite large. When the US implemented busing in the 1970s and 80s, the black kids that were forced to go on these buses often had to take 1 or 2 hour trips in either direction. Note that this trip time is also disproportionately inflicted on minority students and is likely to be disproportionately inflicted on minority students under their strategies. Why is that? That's because in the US, and what will happen also here, is that white parents whose children were assigned to the bus often fled to private schools. Penno said he would ban the creation of new private schools, but there's lots of existing private schools that parents could flee to. So kids are forced to bus for long periods of time. Why is that bad? 3 reasons. Firstly, it's just miserable for the kids to be on buses for so long. But it also takes a huge chunk of time out of their day, right? Kids need time to play and hang out with their friends. That's incredibly important to their mental health. It's awful to be in school for 8 hours and then also have to be in a bus for an additional 2 hours of the day, right? They also need time to do their homework. In the US, when busing was implemented, the kids who were bused tended to struggle academically relative to their peers because they had to spend so long on crowded buses where they couldn't do their homework, right? So that's the first reason. It's miserable for the kids, it stunts their development, and it eats up a huge amount of their time. Secondly, it means kids can't participate in extracurricular activities that are centered on the school, right? You can't stay until 5 or 6 p.m. because there aren't enough buses to take you back. It's too expensive to take a taxi or whatever. Public transit is often really bad, which means that the parents can't afford to let their kids stay at the school. Also, though, kids are cut off from their local communities. Because they spend so much time at school and busing to and from school, that means they don't have much time to engage in extracurricular activities that are centered around their own community because they get home at 6 p.m. each day. Finally, the parents of these kids can't actively engage with the school, right? As a parent, you can't come up at the end of school to chat to the teachers about how your kid is going or talk to them about what classes your kid should take because the school that your kid goes to is really far away from where you live and where you work, which means your ability to engage with your child's education is really limited. What that means is that harms inflicted by busing are great and they are disproportionately inflicted on minority students, which means those minority students can't actually access the benefits of integration that they wanted to talk about. It's much better for the government to aggressively pursue residential integration, which would both garner intrinsic benefits for the children because residential integration is very good, but also all the benefits of educational integration that they wanted to talk about. Very, very proud of this.
Excellent, thank you. I'd like to welcome up second affirmative.
In order for the to win this debate, you have to seriously believe that it would use the same amount of political capital to vastly change the residential scenes of major cities, to spend billions of dollars to build new houses, to force people not just to take a bus for 45 minutes, but to literally leave and move to different parts of the thing. It was not enough for that side of the house to say, we have some political capital, they can use them. And they extremely more political capital on their side of the house, but we tell you that not only is that the case, we also get extreme benefits that don't involve that type of backlash, that don't involve you literally having to move away from your community in order to get our educational benefits. I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to explain why it wasn't enough for them to counter model what they did, and secondly, going to talk about why I think busing is good. Firstly, why it wasn't enough that they were able to counter model. The first thing is, the only capital that they talked about on that side of the house was the political capital associated with backlash. There's other political capital, but there's other capital called money. Look at how much it would take to actually implement what they did. Look, Kiwi Build is an ambitious project that has built like, what is that, 100 houses, 150 according to John BP. That is like $2 billion. And it's likely that their side would probably, you'd probably literally bankrupt New Zealand if you move everyone and pay everyone that lives now in like Revenue area to move to places like West Auckland or South Auckland. Unachievable on that side of the house. We also tell you that it's just much more backlash will occur when you are literally making people move away from communities that they've been long established with. Sure, there will be some backlash when people bus away from places. We are happy to take that backlash, but it is much more backlash will occur when you tell people that the house that they've lived in for 20 years, you're no longer building, that you're telling them you are massively devaluing their house, not just because you're making the skills less valuable, but you're also just essentially making double the amount of houses in those areas. It was unachievable. Resource management law is bogged up, as we all know from that debate that Harper did on that. It's unlikely that's going to work. Okay, secondly, the next attacks we hear is we hear a couple of things. The first one we hear is that zoning isn't that bad, so we shouldn't really care about it. It was kind of a weird tension in their case, right? Because they said that residential zoning was really bad, that school zoning was really bad. We say that's the same reason that residential zoning would be bad on their side, also cause police school zoning would be bad because of the same decision. But it's also important to note that the decision makers who decide on zoning lots of places, like politicians, have incentives to have these rich Auckland grammar type schools, because those are the schools they want their kids to go to. They don't want zones to be inclusive of everyone under status quo, because they don't want their kids to go there. Which means that if we make them have SL5, there's much more likely that zones happen. For instance, in Napier, which I know only about 3 people in the room know how it happens, there's a core area called Maraenui, which is literally next door to Napier West High School. But the zone goes in a weird U-turn around that area because the people who decided to zone in that area decided they didn't want people from Maraenui going to school with people that with their boys, and that was something that meant that people in Maraenui were shut out from good education and had to go to schools that were poorer and schools that had less fair teachers. Okay. Let's get on to why busing is good. And it's important to note that that was a substantive thing that was uncomparative to the benefits that we told you at Penno. We told you that education improves when you get teachers no longer having an incentive to go to one school, they have an incentive to go to many different schools, so you get an equally enough level. We also told you that donations were really important. Importantly, this wasn't just poor people being bused into rich areas, but rich people being bused into poor areas, which meant that the parents of those schools now have incentive to help out those communities, which looks like, for instance, when earthquake regulations mean that your school auditorium is shut down, you much more quickly get donations in order to help your school from wealthy parents who are now able to go out and essentially make sure those kids have this facility. It also means that those parents are much more likely to be able to coach their school sport team because they have more time, because they don't have to work as long as poor parents do. They're particularly good. We heard some responses to this. The first one we heard is that they'll move to private schools, but they ignore the fact that while there might be some private schools at the moment, those private schools all have caps. The government is able to not allow those private schools to be lifted. We think when that happens, they don't have the option of going to private schools. The second thing they said is that it would take a lot of time. And look, in the 70s in America, this was true, right? It's true that come out sound like having to bus for a couple of hours. But it's not true that in New Zealand, where this debate is likely to take place, that the types of time between trades they talked about are the same. And it's probably even in Auckland, the most people probably bus is an hour, which we say is a worthy trade-off to the fact that you get a much better education, that you're much more likely to get employed because you no longer go to school that is seen as dog shit. You're more likely to get those benefits. But also, and this is you won't be able to go to sport afterwards. Well, you just have a bus at 5 o'clock, right? You have a bus at 5:30 if that's been practiced here. Very easy to get around those types of issues. So you're able to have extra trips around outside the house. The other thing they said is that parents aren't able to actually go in and they aren't able to essentially go into those schools. The first one is, parents, if they are able to go in school, can bus there, and they can lead their kids and parents and teach on their days by busing to those areas. But importantly, the types of parents that we're talking about the benefit from under the side of the house are the parents that are time poor, so understatus aren't able to go into those schools. They would rather have teachers that they trust and rely on. They would rather have good infrastructure in those places than be able to go in that side of the house. Yeah, so overall, we think that that is important and that the attacks that will levy weren't things to be rid of busing. There is a huge benefit. The final thing I want to talk about is social segregation. And it is something that's really important. Because even if you force people to move to different places, it is important that their kids go to schools with people that are different from what they are. That means that when they go out into society, they haven't just lived in an area of King's College. They haven't done those types of things that mean that they only see themselves as existing in a world that is like them. When they are forced to interact with people who are not like them, who have challenges that they have no experiences, they're more likely to care about those people, vote for good things, like maybe changing residential learning laws in the future, something that they care about. They're really, really hard to oppose.
Excellent. I'd like to welcome up second Ned.
Side affirmative completely fails to understand the comparative. Obviously, we never thought that it was going to cost the same amount of money to bus 1,000 kids to a school as opposed to moving 1,000 families into a neighbourhood. We said that the second type of integration was better because it was real. It meant that you weren't forced onto a bus to be treated like cattle, to spend hours of your day staring out the window while the other rich kids had time to do their homework. It said that now that you got to engage in extracurricular activities, it meant that people knew you as a person rather than just a token member of your school. It meant that you didn't seem to have this huge segregation between your community and your family and the good life, what you should be aiming for, right? We might have gotten slightly less integration, but that integration was better, and that's why we must win the debate. In my speech, I'm going to do a few things. Firstly, a discussion of what integration is important in this debate. Secondly, a discussion of comparative political capital, unlike they wanted to characterise, it's actually less than they said we needed and more than they said they needed. And then we're going to talk about this integration and moving from your community. So let's go on to integration. As I alluded to in my introduction, even if you get slightly more kids attending mixed schools than our model, we are happy to make that trade-off. Because it's not just about the numbers, it's the quality of engagement, i.e. whether you integrate socially with these groups and whether you have the capacity to appreciate the hardship of these groups. Why does this not happen in the status quo, and why is that not sufficient? Because you have face-to-face interaction with poor people every day if you're a privileged kid. The guy working at the dairy is never going to be able to afford to send his kid to university, and their comparative, they provided no mechanism beyond just the kids are there at your school, right? So really you're just going to have more of these face-to-face interactions, just like you have with the dairy guy, but there's no reason why you start to see them like more as a human. In fact, we often think it's the opposite result, right? Because just interacting and seeing kids, it's often likely to reinforce stereotypes as opposed to dissuade them. For example, if you come from a lower socioeconomic household and are told that school is less important to you, you might be more likely to be disruptive in class, and rich kid sees that and only sees that rather than getting to have a conversation with you after class, and now you're the brown kid that likes to talk too much in class. That stereotype is reinforced because you're only engaging with those people on a surface level and never having a discussion about the struggles that they face. Shakked also said that non-education benefits are important, right? So we would rather have less people go and have housing benefits from redistribution there, because it's also important that kids can go to the doctor, right? It's also important that kids can go to the library. All of these things are equally, if not more important. Final point here in framing is that there are flow-on effects from integration. Basically, they said, oh yeah, you'll be good, and then you'll get to know that kid, and then you'll be friends with that kid. But we think when you have deeper level integration, you only need to make one friend from that core community to create deeper empathy that spreads onto how you interact. So our model doesn't actually require busing all the cattle into school. You only need to know one kid, and then it flows on to those disadvantaged communities. Now, let's have a conversation about comparative political capital, because they just said, oh, you're going to do Kiwi building, it's going to be too complicated, money, money, money. So, we had two responses to this. They forgot our zoning regulations, i.e. we were going to use the same political capital to make radius zoning. The stuff that Sam talked about is out of the debate, right? I.e. if you have 5 kilometres, you are allowed to go within that school in a circle. That's really good because communities are often diverse in that way, right? Because all communities need low-skilled people to sustain that community and high-skilled people. Therefore, within a region, you often have poor people and rich people who will now be going to the same school. But secondly, it's worth them actual extra money for actual integration. We'll just throw dollars at it, right? Secondly, you're forcing people to move away. We're not forcing people to move away. Obviously, if they're happy in their zone, they're not going to leave it. We're just giving greater opportunities of accessibility for people who want to move into the richer zones. Finally, we don't need all the poor people to start moving to rich neighbourhoods. Actually, I've already said that. Now let's talk about geographic integration and why it's bad. Because they provided, again, no mechanism beyond you just see these people and all of a sudden you understand their struggle. Firstly, we tell you that you are actually not solving this problem, because in their model, they give the kids a choice between schools. They say you'll be able to select 3 skills. Obviously, they're going to select the school that's closest to their house, so you're still going to get that separation there. That is mitigatory towards their benefits. But we also had disadvantages, right? We told you that this will disproportionately affect poor kids. You have no idea how unpopular it is to be to say your kid has to sit on a stinky bus next to the stinky 14-year-old boy for 2 hours while they go there. How is little Johnny going to do this lacrosse practice? Oh no, right? Because parents with those political capital, the same political capital that they use to make new school zones, they also use to say, I don't want my kid going on a bus. Even if they can't change the system, there are different alternatives. They can fly to private school. They said, we'll cap it. Is that going to really happen when these kids are so angry and when these parents are so angry, right? The political capital they use is not wanting kids to come into their school. Also, busing them into your school makes them come into your school, right? But they also we think private transport alternatives are a huge benefit in this debate. So basically what you're going to get is these kids sitting, even if we take them at their best and it's just an hour on the bus, that is actually depriving you of those opportunities. They say, we'll send later buses. Again, who's that going to happen? If the parents don't want you to take these bus rides, they don't want you to integrate, and they're never going to give you that situation. On our side of the house, we got true integration because the kids spend less time on a bus, more time at school, more time in their communities, and more time resolving those issues and having a better life.
Excellent. I'd like to welcome up negative reply.
The affirmative team's objection to our counter-proposal was that we face political backlash which would limit our capital to accomplish what we wanted to accomplish. Yet they simultaneously wanted us to believe that wealthy parents would be silent and complacent and wouldn't rise up when they banned new private schools, when they aggressively capped the roles of private schools to prevent rich parents from moving their kids to private schools. That was absurd, right? The fact of the matter is, both sides in this debate are proposing what is essentially a radical attempt at social engineering. Both sides are inevitably going to face backlash, which means the amount of capital that both sides have access to is very similar. The question, given that, is which side's proposal is actually superior on the merits of the policy, and we think ours is clearly superior. Two questions in this debate. Firstly, what matters? Secondly, on comparative political capital. Wow, similar to Emily's speech, that's convenient. Okay, firstly, this is a debate about how to allocate a finite amount of political capital between two different proposals. Integration through busing or integration through residential integration. Firstly, even if we have less political capital than them, that is, even if we get less residential integration than they get busing integration, why is that still worth it? Two reasons. Firstly, because we explained to you that the quality of the educational integration that we achieve is much better, because we achieve educational integration while still giving poor kids the opportunity to do their homework, to play with their friends, and to engage in extracurricular activities. But secondly, we told you that we get lots of benefits from non-educational integration benefits of residential integration, right? We explained to you that we give kids access not just to the schools in wealthy neighborhoods, but also to the libraries and the playgrounds. But also, as Emily explained, the social integration that they wanted to talk about between rich and poor kids is much, much better because those social benefits have to be accessed outside of educational context, right? You will have to have the rich and poor kids playing together in the street in addition to sitting in the same classroom. So even if we get less residential integration than they get busing integration, our residential integration is much, much higher quality, both in terms of educational integration and in terms of non-educational benefits of integration. We don't actually think that they get any, that we get any less political capital. I kind of flagged this in my introduction, right? But the things they were proposing were wildly unpopular too. Like, busing was extremely unpopular in the US precisely because, as Sam accused our model of, it was perceived as an attempt at socially restructuring urban areas and socially engineering the neighborhood, right? Banning private schools is going to prompt backlash from wealthy parents in much the same way that aggressively moving towards residential integration is. Apart from this, like, oh no, you're trying social engineering, no one will be happy with it, the only other response we got was, oh, well, they used lots of money. That's fine, we think it's worth it. The government already allocates huge quantities of money to the construction of state housing. We're just altering where that state housing is going. At the end of this debate, we needed to achieve lasting change, lasting socioeconomic integration, rather than simply busing large numbers of brown kids into rich areas where they suffered academically because they couldn't engage in extracurricular activities, couldn't do homework, and in unfamiliar and alien communities. Very proud to oppose.
Excellent, thank you. I invite Tim with reply to close the debate.
This was a weird V1 debate because it wasn't meant to be fought on the grounds of relative political capital. It was meant to be fought on the grounds of the relative costs and benefits of school busing. And hopefully that's the reason why we're going to lose this debate. I'm going to talk firstly about the counter model, why even if they're right, it doesn't even matter in the debate. Secondly, benefits to kids, specifically getting bused, and then thirdly about social integration. This is about the counter model. The primary reason why we say it's unfeasible to radically change the way that property ownership works in New Zealand is because it's very costly and it's likely to be very politically unfeasible. Hopefully you brought that from the analysis that Sam provided you, but even in the circumstance where you don't, it's probably a policy that takes a very long time, like 10, 20 years. So it's not clear why you don't just use busing in the interim while this sort of thing is going on. There was no explanation of why it was a mutually exclusive model to ours, given that it's likely to be, even if it were feasible, something that would take a long time. Again, why it should have been fought on the grounds of the relative merits of school busing. So, secondly then, I just want to talk about the benefits specifically to kids involved in these sorts of programs. And the analysis that we brought to you right to you from first, and which has not really been engaged with, is the fact that under the status quo, there are systems that cause the allocation of good teachers to schools that are already good and that have wealthy parents there. Allocation of wealthy parents that invest in schools and make them better in a way that means that there is fundamental inequality between schools within the public system. And the only response we get on the efficacy of this is that the bus takes too long. It doesn't take that long, firstly, to get from A to B. It's really not that hard to get from one side of Napier to the other. But even in the circumstance that it did, we told you we'd be happy to bus wealthy kids. So that goes some way to mitigating a lot of the doom and gloom that we heard, particularly from Emily. But the last thing to say here is that in this debate, obviously you have to make a trade-off with the other benefits, right? So that's why it's important that they never even tried to mitigate the fact that now you might have a breakfast when you go to school because there are parents who can pay for that kind of thing. That you might have facilities that allow you to go to school and actually learn and not be freezing cold because there's no heating. That allow you to have a good teacher that can give you benefits beyond just being on a bus for an hour. Do your goddamn homework on the bus for an hour. I went to school with an hour commute, I'm fine. Everyone with an hour commute, they're fine. It's just weird to say that it doesn't work because you're on the bus for an hour. It's not stinky, just don't sit next to a 14-year-old. The only response we get on this point is that we reinforce stereotypes. Two problems. A, they're kids, right? They just engage with people, they have fun, they go to school. But secondly, if you're going to fundamentally challenge contact theory and say that you're skeptical about the whole thing, it doesn't make sense to say, well, just make them neighbours and then they'll be friends, because that also defeats your own point. The second thing is that you can just go to school. You can be friends with other people that are different to you. This happens all the time, right? You can get jobs in places where they work alongside people that they would never have otherwise met. They become friends with them because they're people too. And that influences the way that you go about your life in the future. It influences the way that you engage with your prejudices and those sorts of things. Even in a circumstance where the biggest, most important thing is getting residential integration in this way, it's better to support some level of integration by making people from different classes be friends with each other, more likely to move to different places. They ought to engage with something to do with it.